So, as many of you know, the NALCS is looking to franchise, more specifically next year in 2018. And I want to talk about why that's a good thing for orgs, but more specifically, kind of a bad thing for players. And with the current teams that are in the LCS, their spots aren't guaranteed. And what this means for them is basically brand buyouts are going to start happening because they can't afford to compete with a lot of these huge VC guys or even huge sports organizations that are going to be looking to buy into the LCS. So, I mean, you already have this happening with Team Liquid with Golden State Warriors or NRG with Sacramento Kings or like Misfits with Miami Heat, Immortals with Memphis Grizzlies or Team Dignitas with 76ers. So this is already starting to happen, and it's because these teams are realizing that they aren't going to have enough money to purchase a franchise spot without these big buyers, this big money to back them when they need it most. And with franchising though, and with the challenger scene basically disappearing, I think the collegiate value is gonna increase, and there needs to be more investment into the collegiate scene in order for them to actually come up to on par or slightly below the LCS. And from the collegiate scene, that's where the player talent's going to come from because they've already been in a team environment. Of course, still there are going to be those solo queue outliers that are just really good mechanically, and teams are finally going to be able to take a chance on these players too. And with that said, player values, they're gonna go down, and the old guard players, their value is only going to decrease slightly because they already have the social following and the personality to offer to a brand or a team. But generally, every player's value is going to go down because there's going to be a increase in the player pool size, and import values, they'll decrease because now organizations don't have to rely on them or their skills in order to avoid relegation. And since the talent pool is just increasing, the orgs, they're going to start investing in new talent, and that means more room for subs, more positional coaches, more infrastructure. I mean, these new players, they're probably going to become subs for these big organizations or these big teams, maybe because they understand their position so well in a solo queue environment, or they understand their champions very well in a solo queue environment too, so they can offer those kinds of tips. And but with that said, I think new value or new players, their value is gonna stay about the same because, I mean, first of all, that's kind of a big problem of new players joining the scene is they just don't know their value, so they're going to take whatever they get offered. They have no social following in order for them to boast those numbers. No one knows their personality at all, and it's just kind of a big risk to invest in a new player currently. But with that said, these players that have bad personalities, I mean, you have, well, I'm not going to name any names, but you have players with bad personalities, and I don't think they'll be tolerated. Currently, right now, they are tolerated because of their skill, but once there's no fear of relegation, there's not going to be any need for them. They give a bad team environment. In the long run, they're worse for your team. So you might as well just invest in newer talent or even worse players in order to build them up so that they may possibly become better than those bad personalities. But with the good personalities, we could probably see longer lifespans of those players some players that just aren't that great mechanically, yet they have a good social following, or they're just really personable. They could see a longer career versus the the bad players and the bad personalities, or even just the less personable players will probably see a shorter lifespan if they don't have the mechanical skills in game in order to keep up. Um, so basically, this is just a kind of power play of the orgs versus the players, and with this franchise move, the orgs, they're gonna get more power, and in order to retain a little bit of that power, some of these players, I think they're going to have to start a union of some sort. I mean, it's going to be more important for the new players, or for the players that are just middle tier, or they don't have as much personality. But in general, I think it's going to be important for these players to start thinking about a players union. So um, and because of that, and because of these teams don't have a fear of relegation, that's just taking power away from the players. And you think of Double Lift to Team Liquid. I mean, he had so much power within that time frame that he could offer, or he could ask for an insane amount of money, and Steve just kind of had to say, okay, yeah, sure. I mean, I'm counting on you to save my brand, to save my organization. So with that, and without the fear of relegation, the fear of losing your whole brand, your whole org, players they're gonna have a lot less power. And I think since you aren't going to get relegated, you're going to be able to build your brand more. You can focus on your branding more, and franchising is going to increase the team's value. It'll increase sponsorships. Those that are already sponsors are now going to have to shell out more money in order to retain their sponsorship with these teams, because there's going to be an influx of sponsorships, especially the non-endemic type. And when people talk about endemic versus non-endemic, so endemic means related to that specific area. So endemic in terms of League of Legends or esports would mean like companies like Logitech. You have Razer, or iBuyPower, things like that. Those are endemic because they deal with computers, they deal with gaming. Some of them deal with League of Legends specifically. And then you have non-endemic like McDonald's, or Coca-Cola, Zero sponsored LCK, which is very surprising. You have Samsung over there, or Jin. So those are non-endemic. And I think we're going to see a huge increase in this, because these sponsors, they're going to be less afraid, because they know that their team is going to stick around for longer because it's a franchise. And speaking of franchising affecting the market, it's also going to affect NA as a region in comparison to other regions as well, and it's going to affect other regions too. In that maybe NA becomes less competitive, as since they have no fear of relegation and they have job security, then we could see less hours of solo queue, and more time spent promoting their own personal brand and their team's brand, with more streaming or more sponsorship events, which is, it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, people got to make money. So, but then we could also see more influx of imports to NA too, because of that job security, and because that since your play doesn't hinge on whether a team dies or lives, there's a lot less pressure. So, but with that, play style can also change dramatically too for these NA teams. Maybe teams start to play more loose. maybe they decide to change their play style for long-term success. Maybe they focused early game macro in the beginning of the split, but they're like, no, this really isn't working. Let's change it up. Let's focus towards a late game. Let's focus dragon objectives, and they just start focusing on that, and they give up their current split in order to gain an advantage later on. So we could just see a change in mindset, a change in how players and coaches think and play the game. And an alternative to if we were to not do franchise at all and just stick with the challenger scene, there's something which is called the Premier League, and they have a kind of parachute payments, which are which is an alternative to the relegation system. So the Premier League, they're kind of the challenger scene of the English Football League, and parachute payments is the LCS teams would pay any of the teams that get relegated from the LCS back into the challenger scene. They would pay those teams a kind of a dividend so that they could help them get back on their feet and start making money in order to qualify back into the LCS, or just to stay afloat and keep their brand alive as they fight through the challenger scene. And this is a problem with current challenger scene, and that newly promoted teams from the challenger scene, they have trouble staying in the LCS because of lack of funds or exposure or sponsorships. I mean, you hear teams as they're fighting, in their best of 5 promotional game, they're talking with sponsorships, and sponsorships are just like, okay, well, if you win this, then yeah, we'll sign with you, but otherwise, like, we're gonna hold our breath. So and this is the crazy, like, world that these challenger teams live in, and the chasm between the top tier teams and bottom tier teams is gargantuan. So paying these teams that get relegated, possibly by LCS funded pool, or in the English Football League, they use their broadcasting money, percentage of that, to fund this pool to the relegated teams. If we could do something like that for the challenger teams, then possibly that could work. But that's kind of giving up a portion of their money, or that these successful teams have already got a hold of. But aside from the suggestions, I think franchising is going to happen, and what I really want to say is that players, they need to think about what this means for them specifically, and how this power shift is going to affect their careers. And they need to start thinking about how their brand fits into the franchise model. If they have a bad personality, maybe they need to fix that. If they have a good personality, they need to leverage that. And their mechanical prowess for in-game, they need to also leverage that harder as well. So there's just these little things that are playing into the factors of how a player can be successful in a franchise landscape, and they need to be very mindful of these aspects going into next year. Oh shit, you're still here? Well, subscribe and hit me up at GG Izento. Peace.